As you probably could have guessed by now, I love video games. And there's one thing that I love even more than playing them, collecting them. When I was a kid, there was always something magical about walking into a shop and seeing all of the colorful boxes lined up neatly on the shelves, each promising hours of fun inside. Back then, it never crossed my mind that one day I would own those very same consoles and games in my own home. But here I am now with quite the collection. Over the years, I've been lucky enough to find some pretty rare and valuable items. But today we aren't going to talk about the value or rarity of these systems. Instead, I wanted to take a look at how far gaming has come by showing you the evolution of the game consoles from the very first generation right up until today. So join me as we do just that. We're going to start this journey all the way back in 1971 with the Magnavox Odyssey. Now, the story behind the Odyssey is quite an interesting one because it wasn't actually the first ever video game console, but it is considered to be the first ever home video game console. You see, before the Odyssey, there were arcade machines like Space Invaders and Pong, which were extremely popular. But the problem with arcades is that they were expensive to build and maintain. And due to this, several companies came up with the idea of bringing these games into people's homes. Several companies tried their hand at producing a home version of these games, but it was Magnavox who ultimately succeeded with the Odyssey, although the console itself didn't have any processing power. It was basically a box with a screen that could output composite video. Instead, the console connected directly to your television and used its existing circuitry to display visuals. This meant that every game had to be custom designed for the TV and couldn't be reused. As you can imagine, this made creating new titles rather complicated. It also meant that there was no real way to save progress or use a controller to play with. Since the game was being displayed on your television, players instead used the dial on the console itself to switch between different gameplay options. Games were loaded via cartridges, just like today, but instead of holding the game's data, these cartridges held the visual information needed to display the game on your television. By today's standards, the graphics were obviously terrible, but for the time they were quite impressive. All things considered, the console sold fairly well and paved the way for future generations of consoles to come. Now I wasn't able to pick up an original Odyssey, but I did get my hands on the Coleco Telstar, which was released 2 years later in 1973. This console was essentially a rebrand of the Odyssey with a few minor improvements. Once again, it connected to your television and used its built-in tuner to display images. However, it did feature a light gun accessory, which allowed users to play shooting gallery-style games like Space Invaders. The biggest improvement, though, was in sound quality. The Telstar featured Atari Punk ears, which are those two small round holes you see on the side of the console. They were originally invented by radio engineer Nelson Thornburg and worked by vibrating a membrane in order to produce low-frequency sounds. Though they weren't perfect, they were definitely an improvement over the beeps and boops of the original Odyssey. Overall, this console was a massive success and helped to further cement video games as a mainstream form of entertainment. With the success of the Telstar, it was only a matter of time before other companies entered the market. In 1975, Mattel released the Mattel Gamer, which looked very similar to the Telstar, but featured slightly improved graphics and a built-in handle for added portability. However, despite the console's promising start, Mattel soon discontinued the Gamer after losing money on an unsuccessful lawsuit. Against the rival electronics company RCA, RCA had produced their own version of the Odyssey called the Studio 2, which was much cheaper than the competition. At $169, the Studio 2 proved to be very popular. Although it lacked the advanced features of the Gamer, players didn't seem to mind. Soon, though, the cheaper price tag became the console's downfall when the cost of semiconductors dropped, allowing more companies to enter the market with consoles of their own. This caused the price of the Studio 2 to drop as well, making it extremely difficult for Mattel to compete. Unfortunately, this trend would continue and become a constant issue throughout the next several generations of consoles. As technology improved, consoles would get cheaper and cheaper, making it difficult for companies to turn a profit. To make matters worse, many of these cheaper consoles were of poor quality, resulting in the industry's first crash in 1983. It was during this time that Nintendo managed to set themselves apart from the competition with the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System. The NES was revolutionary in many ways. Not only did it include a CPU that allowed for much more powerful and immersive gameplay, but it also gave players the ability to save their progress with the use of an internal battery pack. The NES was also unique in the sense that it adopted a hybrid approach to game storage. While most consoles up until this point had used cartridges, the NES opted to use both cartridges and ROM packs, which were essentially small, hard plastic squares that contained the game's data. This innovation allowed for the creation of larger and more complex games that were more similar to those found in arcades. Titles like Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda defined an entire generation of gamers and are still loved by fans today. In fact, Nintendo was so successful that they single-handedly pulled the gaming industry out of its slump and ushered in what is known as the Golden Age of gaming. This era lasted until the mid-90s and included such iconic consoles as the Sega Genesis, the Super Nintendo, and the Neo Geo. The Genesis was Sega's first major console and was essentially designed to compete with the NES. On paper, the Genesis featured better graphics, sound, and even offered support for CDs. In reality, though, Sega was still playing catch-up, and they struggled to secure good titles for the system. Despite this, Sega managed to find a niche audience with their mascot, Sonic the Hedgehog, who appealed to kids and adults alike. Meanwhile, Nintendo opted to improve upon the EA with the release of the Super Nintendo, which brought with it a new processor that offered improved graphics and sound capabilities. Although the SNES was initially compatible with NES cartridges, Nintendo quickly moved away from this and started focusing on CD add-on modules. These allowed players to insert CD-ROMs directly into the console, which not only allowed for more storage space, but also gave developers the ability to include full motion video cutscenes. The last major console of this era was the Neo Geo, which was produced by SNK. The Neo Geo was a very expensive console that was marketed towards adults. It featured a unique design that allowed players to easily connect and battle each other in person. The Neo Geo had a massive library of fighting games, and is largely responsible for the popularity of fighting games today. Once the 90s rolled around, gaming would never be the same. Sony shocked the world with the release of the PlayStation, which marked the beginning of the 3D era of gaming. Unlike previous consoles, the PlayStation didn't rely on pixels to display graphics. Instead, it utilized polygons that were manipulated in real time. This allowed games to have much more realistic visuals. But the PlayStation wasn't the only console to hit the market that year. Also released in 1994 was the Sega Saturn. The Saturn was quite strange in the sense that it had two processors, one for audio and one for video. This allowed the system to perform much better than the PlayStation in terms of speed and frame rates. But its unique architecture made it very difficult for developers to create games for it. The Saturn was doomed to fail from the very beginning. As the years went on, gaming would continue to evolve with consoles like the Nintendo 64, the Sony PlayStation 2, and Microsoft's Xbox. Each new generation brought with it more powerful hardware, better graphics, and more immersive gameplay. It wasn't until 2005, though, that another big shift occurred with the release of the Nintendo Wii. The Wii marked the return of family-friendly gaming and showed that a console didn't need to have the best graphics in order to be successful. This paved the way for consoles like the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3, which were marketed towards a more mature audience. After this point, gaming became increasingly competitive with each new console offering better graphics, more online features, and exclusive titles. Eventually, though, this would lead us to where we are today with the current generation of consoles. Microsoft now dominates the market with their Xbox series, while Sony hangs on with their PlayStation 5. Nintendo, on the other hand, continues to cater to a younger audience with their Switch. And so here we are at the end of our journey. As you can see, gaming has come a long way since the days of Pong. Today, S consoles are practically supercomputers, and the future looks even brighter with innovations like virtual reality and who knows. Maybe one day we'll be playing games in our phones or even in our brains. Okay, maybe not that last one. Regardless, I hope you enjoyed this quick overview of the history of game consoles. If you liked it, please feel free to leave a like and check out some of my other videos. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.